listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to anthropologist Beth Singler.
The more we personify AI, and that is fed into by science fiction, the less we see the humans in the system. We see the AI more and more as the anthropomorphic entity, and we don't see the robomorphism of the humans being placed in the system.
Beth shared her thoughts on the misconceptions surrounding artificial intelligence, the dangers of treating humans like machines, and whether virtual reality could provide us with quasi-religious experiences. So Beth, your work deals with the relationship between human beings and emerging technology and questions whether there are similarities in how we engage with theology. But as an anthropologist, how do you think our behavior has already been changed as technology has developed?
Yeah, so I think a lot of my interest in this area comes from our assumptions and stories that we tell ourselves about what AI is, where it's going, what it already is as well. So the misconceptions between actual practical uses of AI and the dreams and imaginaries we have around the technology, even as it is now, as well as into the future. So when it comes to the sort of religious studies aspect of my work, I'm very interested in continuities of narratives and tropes and imagery that we use to describe AI and represent it in various different spaces, even in sort of the most overtly secular business-like spaces. And it's to really unpack that distinction that we've sort of already made there between the secular and the religious, and to see where there is this blending and merging of ideas from both sides that we actually also see in religious groups, adoption of technology, adoption of AI, adoption of metaphors about machines. So there's a two-way interaction that as an anthropologist, I'm observing and to a certain extent participating in by getting into the spaces where that's happening.
Well, you mentioned metaphor there. It certainly feels like, especially on this podcast, we talk more and more about machinic metaphors and how we apply them to human beings. So do you think we're every day engaging in mechanomorphism, robomorphism? Do you think we're so willing to see the human being as some form of machine?
Yeah, obviously this has a very long history. I mean, there's periods of time where we used whatever technological metaphors were around us. So we thought of the human being as a factory. Before that, we looked to the stars. And if we believed in astrology, we used astrological systems to see the mechanistic view of the human with the metaphor of the age. So now our current metaphor is the AI brain. We blur the boundaries between the human and the machine by using that metaphorical language. Absolutely.
But I think at least what's different about the machinic metaphor, what's different about the digital metaphor is that it has a feedback loop. I mean, that's kind of built into cybernetics anyway. There's an algorithmic feedback loop where if we assume that we are some form of machine, then we behave on these digital technologies in a very robotic way. And the algorithmic biases within these technologies feed that back onto us. So what is that doing for the conception of the human being in the 21st century?
Yeah, absolutely. In that feedback loop, though, there is another stage where we treat others as machine-like. Yeah. So this robomorphization is a word I really like using, and I want more people to pick it up, is the increasing treating of others as though they're machines as well. Yeah. So you see it in the response of workers at Amazon in the factories who are not getting the breaks they need and not getting the respect for being physical human beings and actually protesting with signs that say, I am not a robot, so you don't need to treat me this way. And the metaphor has impact. So it's very important that we don't just sort of treat this as entirely a level of metaphorical discussion. It actually has have an impact on people's lives. If we see people as completely quantifiable, as treatable as machines, then we lose something. I'm not necessarily a human essentialist, but I think there's still a certain level of respect that needs to be involved in our interactions with other human beings.
I mean, as an anthropologist, where do you think this move towards seeing the human as machine came from?
It's a combination of factors. I mean, capitalism is at play there, the neoliberal approach to community and society, our distance from each other that increases through social media. I will caveat all this by saying I try to be as agnostic about the benefits and the negatives of technology as possible and see actual use cases rather than doing a sort of broad stroke. Social media is bad. Get off Twitter. Because if you know anything about me, you know I'm on Twitter an awful lot. Yeah, that's one of my failings. But this interaction we have with other human beings through that one step removed that's only increasing, I think, has an effect on how we view others. And it comes from so many different sources. I was looking recently at the concept of philosophical zombies, which is something that comes up in more kind of high-level academic discussion, but is filtering now out to public discourse and is having an impact on how people treat each other. You know, some people say philosophical zombies, or they talk about people being NPCs, non-player characters in a game, which links perhaps to simulation theory, the idea that we all, in some way, in a simulated universe. Those sorts of ideas do have impact on how we work and treat each other.
Well, it's certainly having impact on how we develop technology. I mean, there's been a lot of buzz in the past 2 weeks over this thing called the Metaverse, a place in which we can both express our humanity and yet express our robotic tendencies as avatars. Do you have any initial thoughts on this concept of the Metaverse?
I love in so many ways how unnovel this is. Like, this is something, if you've spent any time thinking about digital culture and looking at the history, I mean, I started being online, this I'm going to show how old I am, in the late 90s with like chat rooms and first stumblings into things like Second Life and massively multiple online role-playing games. I was a big WoW head for a while. And, you know, these spaces have already existed. Arguably, they exist on social media formats as well. What concerns me is not so much the human move into a metaverse space, that this is Facebook becoming the metaverse. The openness of some of those early attempts at creating some sort of form of metaverse is not necessarily there when one corporate entity tries to lay claim to the meta. I mean, obviously, with the big name change, there's a few companies out there already going, but we were called Metaverse. It becomes proprietary, and that's not really what the kind of the first people on the electronic frontier of the internet were really about. And is this the direction everyone keeps talking about Web3 as well? Is this the direction we want something called Web3 to go into? Or is this just another way of bounding a space to sell it? And that concerns me.
It's not just about the proprietary nature of these virtual spaces and how they're being locked down by large corporations, but it's also the nature of how we engage with our identity in these spaces. Because as you teased there, originally the idea was you'd be able to create an avatar and be so fundamentally different from your verifiable identity in the quote-unquote real world. But a lot of these platforms, they rely on the fact that you bring yourself, the version of yourself in IRL, in real life, for want of a better phrase, you digitize that and bring that with you into the metaverse. The promise of the metaverse is we could have complete freedom to explore a multitude of personalities, a multitude of genders, and perhaps a multitude of species. I mean, in some cases, people went into these metaverse spaces, especially in Second Life, as animals rather than humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that freedom as well, it can be curtailed by the microeconomics, microtransactions that will necessarily end up being involved. I mean, even that clip we saw with Zuckerberg is, you know, oh, I've seen this great graffiti artist. Let's pay so we can keep seeing this graffiti artist's VR work, or AR, I suppose. I don't know. So yeah, that sense of what identity are you enabled to put on because you can purchase it? What is excluded from you because you can't purchase it, or because the platform itself decides that this is not an identity you're allowed to put on? I also find it quite amusing that the representations in some forms I've seen, the avatars don't have legs, which, you know, I'm not going to try and do a deep academic dive on that, but I think it's just interesting that a decision was made at some point that legs don't matter in the metaverse. I mean, there's variations on form, obviously, but
there's partly because of the form of engagement, is you're usually sitting at a shiny glowing rectangle. You're usually sitting at a machine, as we are right now, conversing through these shiny glowing screens, I guess, and the legs really don't matter in this form of communication. So I guess the legs are just an unneeded aspect to engaging with the metaverse, whereby the user is still going to choose to at least be sitting. A lot of people don't have these large spaces that they can run around with, or even these suits that they can wear that allows them to control all of their limbs within the metaverse.
I can see that as an argument, but I suppose I was saying this to you before we started. I tend to be quite an embodied speaker. I've got the Italian hands going. I don't know. I think I have Italian ancestors like several generations back, but also my legs are going too. There's more going on in the interaction, but I suppose you're right. I mean, until we get to the haptic suit of the Ready Player One scenario where it's all, you know, on the treadmill, but that's, I think that's an interesting illustration of the distinction we choose to make between we're going to use quotation marks again with IRL and the digital realm, that our representations are partly chosen by us, but they will partly be chosen by platforms, and they will make decisions on our behalf of who we can be as an avatar. And that's an interesting area to get into, the whys and the wherefores.
But I mean, part of the adoption of Web 3.0 as a part of the metaverse is problematic because the promise was it would be decentralized, it would allow for full creative freedom, and yet really it's being platformized again. They're creating the stacks through which we will engage with Web 3.0, and we don't truly have the freedom that is already being explored by individuals who are in the metaverse. There's VTubers, for example, virtual YouTubers, individuals like Code Miko, who are donning these form-fitting cyberware suits and being able to engage with their audiences through these Twitch channels, and yet they come through as an avatar, a fully embodied, beautifully created, artistically performative avatar. It feels like all of that is going to be lost to the lowest common denominator here.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I mean, some of my previous work, I suppose you could describe as being around problematic identities. So my master's work was on the pro-ana community, the pro-anorexia community, and how they personified and deified anorexia. But just thinking about it in terms of who gets to form community, there would be prohibitions on certain representations that could be deemed harmful. So there's a whole conversation to be had there as well about who gets to choose identities that are acceptable. Where are the limits of how we allow people to present themselves? And that's a really difficult conversation. I wouldn't want to be one of the people who's coming down on one position or another there, because there are people's choices that to other people seem like a bad idea. So it's a whole area that's going to be explored ethically. And I think that's just such an exciting time for the ethical conversation with the technology developing in particular ways.
Yeah, I guess we've already been creating those sorts of avatars through Facebook's differentiated platforms such as Instagram. I mean, people create these versions of themselves whereby they don't just Photoshop themselves, they Photoshop the entire reality around them. So I guess that's kind of been preparing the ground for being able to create the idealized version of you that's representative of you in virtual form.
Or some of these ideas of using sort of Google Glass AR to create mirrors that, you know, like the Harry Potter mirror of Erised, like it tells you a more perfected version of yourself. If only you make certain changes to your behavior that you can then put into the algorithm, and it will demonstrate what would happen to your physical form on the outcome of that. So yeah, there's a whole area of technology there into the idealized self as well.
Now, Beth, despite your incredible insights into technology, your background is actually theology. So I just want to ask, how did it occur that you saw there was a theological basis through which we can understand emerging tech?
My degrees are in theology and religious studies, but I'm a religious studies person. So I'm more from the anthropological perspective. So I'm not coming at this with any particular theological stance, but I do pay attention to when people have theological approaches to technology. It's a distinction that can be subtle, I suppose, but it's the difference between being within the community and outside the community, observing the community. So I tend to be, as an anthropologist, a participant observer of people's religious ideas and how they apply them to technology. In that sense, as a religious studies scholar, I'm very interested in, I suppose, the stories that we tell ourselves. And I include within those the religious ideas as a sort of agnostic researcher. I include those religious ideas and also where our ideas about technology end up shaping themselves into familiar guises that we recognize as religious. So there's a whole debate about the ethics of calling something a religion or not. And in some cases, some of the groups I look at would specifically see that as a harm. If I say that what they are doing is religious, they are so antithetical to religion that they would dislike that. They would see that as calling them irrational. It would be very problematic. So it's a difficult area to navigate where you want to say we're doing things that look like religion, but with that pushback from that secular stance or sort of strongly atheist or new atheist stance as well. But there's so many occasions where the ways in which we talk about AI in particular take on the language, and I say the narratives and the images and the tropes from religion, and we have to pay attention to that because it's as much a distraction from what's actually happening as some of the more speculative science fiction ways we think of AI as well. So we need to try and dig down into the actuality so people have a way to respond to technology as it changes.
I mean, in some cases, that's very obvious. When we talk about creating robots, we will often talk about creating them in the image and likeness of us. To turn a phrase borrowed from the Bible, things created in the image and likeness of us. Stuart Brand famously said that technology allows us to become gods, so we better become good at being these gods. I mean, are these again just metaphorical turns, or is there something very tangibly similar to the way in which we engage with religion, capital R?
So I've looked specifically at some of the illustrations we use of AI, where you will have a version of the Sistine Chapel and the creation of Adam by God, the moment of divine creation as represented predominantly a Christian perspective, and how that's played out again and again with, the human hand and the robot hand, or the AI hand, quotation marks, where it's some sort of vector of light. And how we illustrate AI is very interesting. The colors we use, the shapes, there's really interesting work being done on our representations of AI. And I looked quite specifically at this. And it comes with a lot of cultural and emotional baggage that we know what this image is. It's been remixed so many times. I call it the AI creation meme because the Sistine Chapel imagery has been memed so many different ways. I found some of my new favorite ones recently. I saw one that was created out of segments of a Satsuma. You're probably more familiar with things like pop culture versions, like Homer as God, or, reaching for a remote control, or various different versions, or the flying spaghetti monster. But when it comes to AI and our specific ideas about this moment of creation, the sort of, some illustrations also have the spark of life moment, that between the human hand and the robot hand, there is something being transmitted that we could call life. And with that cultural baggage, therefore, our ideas about what AI will be follow on in continuity with our ideas from a theistic interpretation of the creation of humankind. There's something that we get from our creator, if you believe in one. There's something that AI and robots will get from us as creators. And it tells a story already about what that's going to be like, and the connection that we should feel to our creation as well. So all that is bundled together in something that, as I said, quite often turns up in business spaces, in finance spaces. It was, the EU Commission used a version of this. It turns up in spaces you wouldn't necessarily describe as religious. And that's, again, I want to unpack that distinction between religion and secular, but it's there, it's permeating our public consciousness, it's permeating the discourse, and it leads people to interpret AI as a creation that's here or nearly here in a way that reflects how humans are here and currently here. We're not nearly here, we're definitely here. That has to be understood, I think, the illustrations that we use.
Do you think in some way it's just kind of good marketing? I mean, I always wonder with these guys who get so concerned about the possibilities that robots could overtake humanity. I just wonder if they're saying these things to drive a certain narrative that this stuff will be as good in the future. It's almost like self-fulfilling prophecy. If they say, "Oh God, the thing's going to be smarter than us, it's going to kill us," then maybe it will. But in actual fact, it's still doing basic stuff.
There's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of affective impact that's being drawn on when a company, a corporation chooses to use that kind of imagery. And it's not limited to that. I mean, I see the word faith and belief being employed in corporate spaces. Obviously, the benefits of religious imagery and tropes, they want to bring those in. So people get this sense of trust, security. This is something that we can build in a particular direction. Absolutely. It has an effect that leads people into thinking that these things are inevitable. Also because the creation story is a story of rebellion as well. So you can link this to some of our robo-apocalypse fears. Quite often, I mean, some of my digital ethnographic work is about looking at the moments in which there's an advance in AI or robotics and how that is shared and disseminated and responded to on social media. So people immediately jumping to the big tropes of, Skynet and Terminator and Boston Dynamics dancing robot means we're all going to die. And that leap is also informed by those sorts of narratives and imagery that we get from the more religious ideas as well. But if we create something that's just like us, won't it be as bad as us as well? The mistakes that we made in some of the theistic discourse. And, obviously this is a very specific monotheistic interpretation. There are other religious communities and cultures that have a different conception of creation, but those images don't get demonstrably disseminated quite as much.
So largely this is influenced by the fact that we're swimming in the hangover of 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian religion. But I also know that you're slightly critical of the idea that, in the West we think of it in a certain way, but in the East they don't have Judeo-Christian religion quite as ingrained in culture. Therefore, they must have some form of different relationship with robots, where robots have souls, for example. Could you explain why that common misconception exists and how you've come to critique it?
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by our blindness in the so-called Western world. I'm doing quotation marks again, which really work very well on an audio podcast. But in the so-called Western world, our blindness to our own animistic history and our own animistic culture that still informs how we think. So a lot of the time, the stereotype is, as you say, in the East, people have Shintoism and Buddhism, and that will lead naturally to an idea of everything having spirits and souls. And we can demonstrate this. There are examples where temples have done ceremonies for technology that has stopped working, or people will point to the differences in utopianism and dystopianism. In the West, we're more dystopic. We have Terminator. We're scared of robots. In the East, they love robots. And it's binary that doesn't hold up if you ever interact in those cultures. Like I say, it ignores the animistic traditions we have in the so-called West. It ignores the points at which we quite happily have utopian views in the West. It ignores ability to draw in entities in the West into our wider cosmology of beings, the number of people who name their cars, who have conversations with their laptops when they go wrong. That we personify and we anthropomorphize all around the world. And there are cultural elements that we can look at different religions and see what they've done to inform the imagery and the narratives. But just as I'm saying with the AI creation meme, it gives you a story about the future of AI that involves personification, that involves the possibility of being good. I mentioned the possibility of rebellion, but also the possibility of being a faithful descendant of the creator, the human creator. We can look at some of the really impactful science fiction, like long-standing narratives like Lieutenant Commander Data in Star Trek, who gives you the vision of the aspirational robot who wants to be more and more human. It's more complex. It's a hangover, I think, from an Enlightenment era onwards meta-narrative of how we became more rational in the West and we became more intellectual, and an othering of people in the so-called East. And it's a techno-orientalism that I want to push back against. And I want to do it, as I say, through recognizing what aspects of those characteristics we put on other people that we actually have here in the West, including animism, personification, anthropomorphism, and deification as well.
Well, that drive towards increasing rationality, part of that is captured in technology. And I know you're critical of the idea that we're becoming a more secular society on the whole, because many people still maintain some form of faith, whether that's explicit or implicit, whether that involves going to church or not. But do you think in any way, shape or form, technology is the reason for a move towards a society that purports to be secular, even if you've, as you say, they might not be as secular as we think they are?
Yeah. I gave a presentation recently at an institute that's filled with theologians and religious studies scholars. And I mentioned secularization theory. And they're like, why are you bringing up this theory that's like 50 years old and no one really takes seriously anymore? It's because in society, we adopt that narrative that says religion is dying out. We're becoming more intelligent, more rational. And these are the things that we'll leave behind as a civilization mature. I think it's a story we're telling ourselves that makes ourselves feel more intelligent, more rational. If we can poo-poo people who do that strange religion stuff, then we, as I say, with the techno-orientalism that we see with that East-West dichotomy, if we can see ourselves as superior, that's a story that we're telling ourselves about where we're going. And technology doesn't preclude religion. I think that a lot of the religion and science debate at a larger level is about, claiming spaces. But when it comes to technology, it's employed by religious groups. It has been since the year dot with religions. And it doesn't necessarily lead to diminishment of that. In many cases, as I look at my work, the spaces that technology enables more conversations about religion and spirituality that lead to new religious movements, which I've looked at as well, the emergent religious groups that make a claim for having a new way of thinking about the world. And they perhaps as a community don't find each other without technology.
You mentioned there's some new forms of religion. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those forms of religion? Because something that features heavily on this podcast is this idea of transhumanism. And I know it causes a lot of kickback when you call transhumanism a science-based form of religion. But if you look at the thing, in many ways, it kind of is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with religion. It's one of those, we could never come up with a sufficient definition, but if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, people will say it's a duck. So with religion, if you see people behaving in particular ways, I tend to look more towards aesthetics and tropes and narratives. But yes, also if you look at people showing particular interest in something, that for some people is a definition of religion. If you have something that you hold up as most important in your life, it's the sort of definition of religion that Yuval Harari uses when he talks about dataism in his book Homo Deus. That's not always my favorite definition, but that's one way of understanding it. So if you, by that criteria, if you say that people who are interested in transhumanist ideas are dedicating their lives to a pursuit of a future that they imagine in particular ways and want to bring that about, it starts to sound very eschatological, you know, the idea of religion looking to bring about the new age, however they define that, whether that's heaven on earth or some sort of form of rapture. And it's no surprise that people talk about the singularity as a transhumanist idea, as the rapture of the nerds. Yeah, there's a famous book which I recently wrote a book chapter about, and Charles Stross, and it's Dr. Cory Doctorow, of course. It's not surprising there are these parallels, and it's partly, I think, because the language we use is so dependent on our cultural context. It's hard to have big ideas that end up paralleling previous big ideas without using some sorts of language. And you can talk about hopes and fears as well. The ideal utopia is also counterbalanced in some of these transhumanist narratives with the dystopia of sometimes the vengeful AI god. Things will go wrong, we need to be careful, or, you know, there may be a simulated hell that we're all plonked into because we didn't work towards producing the singularity, if you know Rocco's basilisk as a concept. So there's these elements that seem to quack like a duck. And it's difficult, as I say, because if you tell some people that what they're doing seems religious, they don't like that. But then conversely, there are some transhumanist groups who are very upfront about wanting to create transhumanist religions. So there's Christian transhumanists, there's Mormon transhumanists, there's specific groups who talk about creating an unreligion. So they want to hack the elements of religion that are successful and employ them to get people into transhumanist ideas, because this is the way of the future, in a sense, for some people, that this is the direction we're going, but we need to get as much of the population engaged in it as possible. And if religion gets people together, then that's one tool that we should use. It's a technology, after all.
I mean, could we use religious tropes to actually educate people about technology? Should we adopt more of the ways in which religion is communicated to help us communicate better about both the possibilities and, I guess, the dangers of things like digital technology?
There's a wonderful speculation on this, and if you've heard it before, you can correct me about who came up with it, but this idea of warning future generations about nuclear waste by creating generations of cats who glow in the presence of radiation, and then also kind of having symbology around that present the space in which the nuclear waste is as sort of profane, and, you know, pulling on things like Mary Douglas's concept of purity and danger that applies in so many religious conceptions, having taboo areas. And likewise, I suppose you could make an argument for the safety of humanity if you believe AI is going a particular dangerous direction, using those sorts of effective elements and tools. I mean, it's something I suppose corporations have been playing with for at least the 70s, 80s, creating a workplace culture that pulls on some of the community building that religions employ. If you're deeply cynical, you can talk about how they employ the elements that new religious movements do when they're particularly negative, where they draw in membership and induce fervor, but also isolate people from their families and their lives with long days and versions of love bombing. There's people who've written about the sort of Silicon Valley culture as a sort of microcosm of religions interacting with each other in that sense. So it depends on your agenda and whether you want to do this for good or for ill, I suppose, which is arguably what you could say about any religious group as well.
It certainly feels like the way in which we interact with at least digital technology has some mythos embedded into it, some form of faith, if anything, embedded into it. And you've spoken before about being blessed by the algorithm. So what do you mean by that phrase, and how is it being used?
I want to be very clear. I did not come up with this expression. Okay. So this is not me trying to inseminate the world with this concept of being blessed by the algorithm. So no, I as a digital ethnographer, I spend a lot of my time looking for interesting patterns and expressions and phrases and images on social media. And one of the things I did notice was this expression, blessed by the algorithm, and digging around and finding examples of tweets. It's not on the scale of some of the memes that you might come across on the internet, but I found a corpus of 170 odd specific tweets with retweets and people copying and so forth. And that expression was being employed by people who felt like the so-called algorithm behind the scenes on either a gig economy platform, social media platform, somewhere that they had produced content or being recommended content, this sense that the algorithm behind the scenes on those places was making a decision that blessed them in some way. So if they're a gig economy worker, maybe a Lyft driver or an Uber driver, having a good day, they felt like they had been blessed by the algorithm. So this is an expression some people were throwing out. Some people didn't give context at all. They just tweet blessed by the algorithm. It's, again, as I say, it's these continuities of religious form in a space that's presumed to be secular, but it also speaks to the non-transparency of these systems that we know if we dig around in the algorithm of YouTube, it's not making decisions because it likes you or you're lucky or you've been virtuous in some way. And these are some of the reasons people gave for being blessed by the algorithm. It's weighted on values that relate to the corporate interest. So if it's YouTube, it's getting eyes on videos, and certain videos get more eyes, get more likes, get more subscribes. So that's all built into that system. It's non-transparent, but people want to make sense of it. And one way to do that is to use this metaphorical language of, I did well and I got blessed. My song was uplifted on Spotify, or my video got lots of hits because it was prominent because of the algorithm. My Instagram picture was put on the popular feed, all these elements. It's interesting to me because, again, it shows that for all our claims of secularity, these elements keep filtering through, and they're unconscious for some people. You know, I did a previous project on a concept in the New Age movement called the Indigo Children, and at one point I was looking at tweets where people just tweeted the words indigo children with no content and no context. And I asked them at the time, you know, why did you, and they just said, it's on my mind. There's this speaking out of instant thoughts that happens on social media. And in this instance, even this small sample set, I think, gives you an indication that people have this kind of framing when it comes to non-transparent algorithms. And we kind of reach for AI as God as a way to understand that.
Yeah, I've always wondered with things like Twitter, whether that's a form of prayer in a weird sort of way. Prayer was always, even if you see it in a secular sense, prayer is useful insofar as it's a conversation with yourself. It centers the mind to think about certain desires and what you want, but there's no guarantee of audience. There is no guarantee of audience. Maybe there's a guy in the sky or something up there, or maybe there's no thing, but at least with Twitter, there's a potentiality of some likes. So is tweeting the 280 character version of prayer?
I think there's certainly similarities, and I think it's worth expanding on prayer's involvement with technology, because yes, you're absolutely right. Some forms of prayer are completely internal, and who knows if anyone's listening or not. I tend to be agnostic on that point as well. But there's also occasions where prayer is enabled by physical spaces, is enabled by technology. People were using prayer wheels to pray in their place for centuries. People use rosary beads to mark prayers off. And those are public demonstrations of lived religion. Like that's something that people can see and pay attention to. And the same thing applies to Twitter. Perhaps your audience is much larger, and it's not exponential so much as just the enhancement of the public nature of religion through technology. So I use the example, if you used to have one person on a street corner talking about their specific form of faith, and if that faith was different to the general populace, they might get a few kind of dismissive glances as people walk past and go, who's that person or what they're saying. But if you go online and you've got that very specific form of faith and it doesn't match the general, you will end up finding specific spaces where there will be people with the same ideas as you. And that's where community starts budding from a very small seed. So likewise, the connections that social media can make when you do broadcast these prayers, thoughts, whatever you want to describe them as, does enable communities to form together. So maybe this expression, unfortunately, I've skewed the field a bit. As an anthropologist, we tend to do this. As soon as you start talking about a thing, having been a part of looking at a thing, then it's hard then to separate yourself out from that. So having talked about blessed by the algorithm, if it increases in volume, it's partly because I've talked about it as well. That sounds egotistical, but it's true. So I'm going to hold on to that. But so if more and more people talk about it, this snowballing of connections could lead to something. And as I say, there are already people who would quite happily describe what they're doing as a new religious movement focused on AI as a conception. I don't know if they themselves use blessed by their algorithm. I'll have to ask a few of them, but it's something that's out there in the public discourse.
Well, it certainly feels like God, capital G, served some form of function in society as a form of surveillance, as a way to assign rules to a populace so that they would live in a certain way. And when we think about all-seeing entities that have the ability to assign certain rules to human individuals, we no longer assume that's a god. We think of a tech company. So is there something godlike about surveillance, data harvesting, and the other sorts of emerging technologies of control?
So commonly in our monotheistic traditions, we rely on the omnis, so omniscience, the omnis, as I call them. It sounds like a band, doesn't the omnis? Omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence. We hope when we describe AI a lot of the time that it'll be omnibenevolent, but we conceive of these abilities as equivalent to omniscience and omnipotence. It's not there yet, which is where this language is filling in the gaps. So the algorithm, quotation marks, because it can be so many different forms, but the algorithm behind YouTube is not omnipotent and it's not omniscient, but it is driving actions that look to users like agency. And that's where we then also get omnibenevolence. I've been blessed by the algorithm. The decision was made to help me. There were a few cursed by the algorithm tweets as well, but it really wasn't as many. And it's such a small sample set anyway. But some people feeling, they had a bad day because the algorithm picked on them. And you scale that up exponentially with ideas about the singularity, and then you get to the kind of science fiction form of the dreadful AI god that you get in things like I have no mouth and I must scream, or even the Terminator pulls on those, and the series of films and TV pulls on those religious tropes to say Skynet basically becomes a malevolent god that doesn't like humans very much at all, and we need some sort of like Christ figure in John Connor to come and sort that all out. It's a very complex, it's not really a simplistic theology. It's not really monotheism in the way you see it in Christianity, but there's a lot of religious tropes there that are being played with.
I'm almost sure, Beth, that there's a cyber security company called Omni out there somewhere who's doing exactly that. But you mentioned science fiction there, and someone who features quite heavily when we talk about these sorts of themes on the podcast is someone like Alex Garland, who's known for Ex Machina and Devs. And in both of those narratives, there were characters who were trying to achieve God-like status. In Ex Machina, it was Nathan. In Devs, it was Forrest and his desire to create this quantum computer that could control time. And in both cases, they were abusing their power. So do you think that Silicon Valley, for example, has that form of God complex? Are there ethical implications for people like Zuckerberg, Musk, and Bezos having so much power over the sorts of tech that we use?
Yeah, it's interesting. The kind of mad scientist trope and the playing God trope goes all the way back. Obviously, we can think about Frankenstein and the idea of putting yourself in God's place in some ways, a warning. In Frankenstein, I think it's a warning, definitely in Ex Machina. Devs is slightly complicated, I think, because I'm a parent as well, but I feel so much for the main character in Devs that he just wants to, bend reality to bring his daughter back. Sorry, spoilers, should have said that at the beginning. But I guess enough time has gone now. It is this narrative we return to of the generally white male person who has decided to be God. And I think partly because we can fit that perception of the individual into our existing monotheistic Abrahamic idea of God as the white guy with the big beard on the cloud. So there's the sense of continuity. And again, with the AI creation meme, I really didn't see any examples where the human hand wasn't definitely not a white hand. There are a few small examples of female hands, but majority were white male hands. So there's a sense of pattern continuity there. But that's, the whole subject of hubris. We want to make sure that no one's actually trying to build the Tower of Babel. Again, like our linguistic metaphors come so often from our cultural context of the Bible, that the sense of humanity trying to supersede God comes into our stories so often. It's an interesting facet of our fears when it comes to AI, that, again, we're worried about this sort of sense of history repeating itself, that we're doing these things again and again in our stories as a warning, perhaps, to people to not do these things now.
Do you reckon the natural fact, if we got over the uncomfortableness of engaging with some of this thinking about technology in a religious framework, that we could actually take things a lot further? So thinking about the transhumanists again, that they are so adverse to being called a science-based religion, and it's because of what you mentioned previously. They hate the idea of being assumed not to be rational, but then everything that they're hoping will come to pass is very much based on faith, that a faith in the fact that we can transfer minds to a brand new silicon substrate, a faith that we will be able to develop technology that can wake us up from our cryogenic freezing, a faith that we can potentially live forever. I mean, they constantly end up fighting against that faith, and yet they're quite happy to engage in these faith-based narratives. Should they just embrace the religious part of their ideology?
Yeah, I mean, quite often the response on my work from those sorts of sectors are around the fact that they don't see it as faith because they have evidence that it's mathematically provable that we're going to get to these things. Specifically, I'm thinking, like the old hat, Moore's law, like accelerating development of processing power proves that we'll get up to human intelligence by a specific point and beyond it into the singularity. So all this is evidential, and that's their distinction, not mine necessarily. That's their distinction between what they're doing versus religion, because religion is based on faith, which doesn't have evidence. I disagree, because there are different forms of evidence for different things. But as again, I remain agnostic, so I don't necessarily take on those evidential claims myself. But there's, absolutely. I think it's interesting for how extreme some of those reactions are. I mean, like I say, I found examples where people are much more positive towards religion, but when it's antithetical, it's quite strong. And it does show an overlapping of that culture with some of the forms of new atheism, some of the rationalist movements. Obviously, it's futurism, but it's entangled in there. There's a very strong idea of what it means to be intelligent.
Yeah.
And it's embedded there from some of the earliest ideas about what AI would be as well. So, there's a great quote from, I think it's Robert Walensky, talking about how the founding fathers of AI at the Dartmouth College and just after defined intelligence as what they could do, that they were good at theorems and maths and playing chess. So if an AI could do that, it must be intelligent. That's how we define it. And we need a broader understanding of what intelligence is. And there's so many people doing good work on this that it needs to be fed into that wider conversation. But it does come with this stereotype at the moment that intelligence is putting away your childish toys. It's humanity civilizing itself to the extent that irrationality is coded out. It's about seeing the millennia of the millions of years of evolution as a messy, destructive process that really not much good came out of, and bad things like religion came out of, but we can supersede that with technology. This is the transhumanist view. And if you have that kind of narrative, I think you're always going to push back against religion, but you're also going to push back against other things like embodied intelligence, some elements of community and culture that aren't specifically religious, but to partake of affect, the emotional relationship that people have. And I think there's a sort of a line of thinking there towards, science fiction gets there and some people like it and some people don't, but the idea of like brains in vats that we can denude, or jumping into the metaverse, we can denude our existence of physicality because pure intelligence is something that's better in some ways. For some people, that's very appealing.
That's the tricky word, isn't it? Intelligence. I mean, you look at a lot of this stuff in context of artificial intelligence, and it always seems to be the drive towards the I word. But in actual fact, becoming gods. It might actually be artificial life that's the thing that would really frighten us. If we believe that there has been some form of emergence to allow life and intelligence to occur, then if we were able to create lab-grown life, then surely that would be the godlike thing we would be doing. The intelligence piece is something that emerges from that afterwards. But from a transhumanist perspective, the way in which intelligence is looked at and the way in which they look at evolution is the fact that they need to take control over that evolution. They need to now insert their own intelligence into the evolutionary narrative, which suggests a form of intelligent design, which oddly enough, the idea of an intelligent designer is a simile for something that may look like a god. And the way in which they justify that is through both a rejection of God but an acceptance of God. Because you ask these people, oh, so hold on, why do you believe that you should take control over evolution? And they go, well, we evolved to this state, we became human beings and we evolved intelligence, and our intelligence is the license for us now to take us into the next place, using technology to fuse us with machines or whatever it may be. And you go, hold on, you're telling me that evolution had a plan to allow intelligence to emerge so that you could use that intelligence to then continue evolution. Well, that sounds a lot to me like intelligent design. There's some sort of grand planner somewhere. So how can they use that justification and also choose to be secular? This stuff is so fuzzy, isn't it, Beth?
Especially if you throw in simulation theory, where if you're familiar, this idea that, because we can create computer games that simulate reality to various degrees of similitude, that someone else could have done that to a greater extent over the billions of years of the existence of the universe, or even prior to the existence of the universe. Perhaps the entire universe is a simulated universe. And you can roll that backwards. It's kind of turtles all the way down. Where do we get to a point where there's the prime universe? But I think it's so interesting that I don't particularly enjoy reading Dan Brown, but some of these some of the elements of that exact argument come out in Origin. If you've ever read Dan Brown's Origin, I've read it about 5 times now, which is 5 more than I really wanted to. But he has this same sort of argument. He's drawing on the work of a physicist, I think, in Oxford, and I forget the name, but this idea that life exists in the universe to create order that allows entropy. And therefore, the entire grand plan of the universe, the main character, pseudo-main character, it's not the Tom Hanks character whose name I always forget, but the main character in Origin has done this. He's sort of an Elon Musk, Peter Thiel type. Yep. He has discovered this great reality. The truth of the universe is that life is necessary to lead to the end of the universe, and shown it to some religious people who then, some of them kill themselves because in the narrative of Origin, this is such a destructive story. I read this going, well, this is just another intelligent design. This is the same thing you're saying. If you start postulating on intention in the lead up to the creation of our intelligence to lead on to our mind children, whatever you want to call them, what comes next, then you are creating at the very least a telos for the universe that we are heading in a particular direction with a particular purpose. And again, that sounds religious. It's quacking like a duck to me. So we keep returning to this difficulty of defining religion, but if you see elements like this, it's hard not to, again, see this as falling into some of the familiar tropes. And I mean, I spent time a while back at a transhumanist conference where people were talking about the greater good in a way that gave it almost agency. And I brought this up at the time saying, you don't want to speculate religiously, but the language you use in describing the greater good and sort of a meta level of ethics and values, it's falling in line again with and they don't want to hear that. They don't particularly. But there are some, like I say, that are more willing to take that line, that they see religion as, if not just a pragmatic tool to be used, but also an underlying reality that always we're going to come back to these same philosophical questions. We'll frame them in different ways. The aesthetics will be different. We'll call that supreme intelligence, whatever you want to describe it as, different things, but these are the same roots to the same place. So there's a variety of response in transhumanism.
It certainly feels like no matter what, God is always in the room, and that's because of culture. I mean, he's an omnipresent being, so from a religious standpoint, he's always in the room. But I mean, nascently speaking, metaphorically speaking, he's always going to be in the room when we talk about these things. And listening to you there reminded me of the conversation I had with Thomas Moynihan on the podcast, where he was identifying the fundamental difference between the extinction of humanity and apocalypse.
Yes.
And in his mind, apocalypse is the decision for humanity to end. There has been some benevolent entity, some form of God that has decided that humanity will no longer continue, whereas extinction is so much worse because humanity has created the circumstances through which that culture and intelligence and consciousness will no longer propagate because they've created circumstances under which we cannot live anymore.
Yeah.
In his mind, I mean, that was the more tragic thing.
Add the religious angle to that as apocalypse in a predominantly monotheistic tradition is not a disaster in the way that it's become in public discourse and our popular understanding of the word apocalypse. It can mean, the moment at which there is a huge shift and change and a new age starts. So, the dispensationalism and the millennialism of various different Christian evangelical faiths, or the idea of, that Jesus returns particular ways. So there's that element to apocalypse that sometimes gets lost in the more popular discourse. But yeah, I can see, I've read his book, at least as far as that part, I remember it very well thinking, this is an important distinction to make because the lack of intentionality is actually in some ways the more dangerous thing, but we ascribe intentionality. So we come up with our stories of robot uprisings when actually the result may just be artificial stupidity rather than artificial intelligence. Much more of a Nick Bostrom paperclip maximizer end, perhaps. I don't know. I still remain agnostic about that one as well. But it's interesting that the assumption of agency that's going on when people talk about blessed by the algorithm or see the AI creation meme as talking about a story of AI creation in similarity to humans, there's a positing of agency and choice there. And the robo-apocalypse is often just that moment, as with Skynet, of the turning on and the sudden decision by the AI that we have to go, where the truth is probably much more banal.
The reason I asked that question was that I wonder if the reason we're so sort of willing to see certain forms of technology as a threat is, again, because baked into Judeo-Christian religion are these ideas of raptures or apocalypses or some form of ends. And it's defined the way in which we think about time, past, present, and future upon this lineal progression. Again, I struggle to say, but especially in the West, where we kind of have this progress narrative towards some form of either singularity or some form of complete and utter destruction of humanity. Do you think if we were to step away from those religious narratives that we'd find more appealing ways to engage with things like the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time, again, it gets forced into this dichotomy between quotation mark Western arrow of time version versus there is other faiths that have a cyclical version of time, and maybe we should learn a bit more from those. That's often the assertion that I see sometimes coming out of Silicon Valley, which has had its long history of connection to the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism moving into the West, a strong connection with the New Age movement. Some of these ideas that people were picking up from other cultures as we gained contact with them were being drawn into the discourse. I mean, the history of yoga in America has like a core point in the West Coast. So this idea that we have an either or comes into it, that we can either have this strongly deterministic telos direction of time, or we can see something more cyclical, and something more cyclical might be more beneficial. Again, partakes of some of that techno-orientalism, seeing the differences between how we think about things and them over there, how they're thinking about things, which is not always entirely useful. But I mean, there's so many different cultures that we're sort of stepping over when we divide everything up into Western Judeo-Christian, which also Judeo-Christian is such a problematic term. Sorry, there's a whole other discussion. The strongly Abrahamic faiths versus the more assumed animistic that misses out on so many locations and cultures and aspects of our own history. Again, I want to keep pushing this. We had an animistic history. We have an animistic present in the so-called West. So it's much more complicated than that. But I think we do tend to grab onto the useful narratives, and the image of history and time progressing in an arrow going exponentially up is useful for some ends. Some of the people who push that narrative are doing so because they want you to buy into the determinism of this technology, that we are definitely going in this direction. We can't swerve away from it. There's no way to jump off the highway at any of the exits. We're absolutely going to that future. And when it comes to talk about the singularity, I get very concerned that that distracts from the present and gives people a sense of fatalism, that if decisions are already at a very small scale being made about their lives, and they're told in the future all decisions will be made about your lives, they just see that as a natural progression. So I think that it's important to be critical, not only because it's an adoption of a cultural narrative that might not fit the times, but also because it leads people into particular views about the direction we're going in.
But it's not just the progress narrative that's problematic, it's the inevitability of that progress narrative. Kevin Kelly had the book, The Inevitable, which was about all of these technologies that are going to come to pass, whether we like it or not. And the inevitability of some of this stuff is what makes me uncomfortable. It's less the direction through which it's going. It's the fact that we're told that this stuff will occur in a way in which we have to have faith that it will, in the way in which we imagine it. And partly that's evangelized, to use another metaphor from religion. It's evangelized by these individuals who are often CEOs of companies who are beholden to their god, which is the stock market. You know, they have to make certain proclamations. We can do this all day.
Yeah,
they
can.
have to make certain.
I mean, even some of them are self-proclaimed tech evangelists. Like, it's not a title that's we're putting on to them. That is on some people's business cards. No one has business cards anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's this form of tech evangelism, and then now saying it and now listening to you say it, there's this certain way in which if you say it and you preach it and you do it with enough fervor, then it will come to pass. You know, it's like coming down from the mountain and saying, hey, this is how the future of electric cars, for example, is going to roll out. And then what happens is that proclamation about the future has direct impact on the present. And the direct impact on the present is the stock market valuation. Suddenly you see these companies' prices increase. And it feels like Silicon Valley's kind of hacked that part of religion in a really affective way.
Yeah, like I say, it goes back to what I was saying about the history of Silicon Valley, the development of the corporation as a religious body in the sense of partaking of some of those elements of new religious movements, the more negative ones. But also, I mean, I think it's worth unpicking the word prophecy a bit as well. I mean, I guess it's because I have a religious studies background. I've spent a bit more time thinking about the different ways in which that word is used, and it's probably not one that comes up for most people. But we have the expression self-fulfilling prophecy, but actually what a prophecy was in the biblical sense was a commentary on the present by talking about what's going to happen to you if you don't change your ways. So there's a negative prophecy in that sense, that we're talking about if you behave in a particular way, the good things are coming. So that's different to a prediction. And I think sometimes we conflate the two, and we see these statements about what's coming as predictions when we should see them as prophecies in that biblical sense of people making moral statements about what's wrong with the world now and what they want the world to be. And sometimes it's the Ray Kurzweils, who is himself also described as a prophet. I think Wired magazine yonks ago called him the prophet of the singularity. And he's played up to that. He's held up the sign, the singularity is near. But that sense of what he's saying about what the future will bring for humanity, when he says things like, we'll be more intelligent, he even says we'll be more sexy at one point. But there's commentary inherent in what he's describing about what he thinks the deficit of the human is now. So the more we pay attention to that kind of underlying message when people say, this technology is coming or that technology is coming, it's telling you more and more about what they think is wrong with the world now. And we should pay attention to that specifically.
Two things there. Firstly, everybody should go Google Ray Kurzweil, because everything that he is saying is kind of coming to pass. You look at photos of him 20 years ago, he looks older then than he does now. He's got like dark black long hair now, and his skin looks great. So whatever he's doing, popping those pills, seems to be...
He's been bribing the creators of the simulation so he can get an avatar upgrade. He's been paying for his microtransactions in the Metaverse.
Possibly. I'm surprised there's not more conspiracy theories around him. They always thought, what was it, Paul McCartney died and was replaced by someone. Yeah. I think maybe the same has happened with Ray Kurzweil. He's been replaced by some form of robot from Google. But joking aside, the word prophecy there, it's important to understand it within that historical context, because the original prophets, they would always prophesize what would happen within the immediate political framework of the age. They certainly weren't imagining volcanoes being set off and the destruction of humanity. It was really about what would happen for certain political families. And I think we need to often remember that when we talk about the way in which we engage with the future through those narratives. But Beth, you're such an incredible fan of science fiction, and I do wonder, are science fiction stories, are they our new fables, I guess?
That's sort of the impact that happens, that we imbibe and imbue ourselves with our stories. And so that's that interaction that we were talking about, the impact of how we see the world is influenced by science fiction, and science fiction is influenced by how we see the world. These two things can't really be extracted from each other. It's an area that's so complex because you don't want to put everything at the door of science fiction and say, hey, you guys, you wrote these things. Now some of these things are coming to pass. It's your fault, because there's no effort at all from science fiction authors to predict the future. Again, it's closer in some ways to the element of prophecy, that it's commentary on now, that science fiction is creating these potential spaces to actually engage with what we're up to at the moment, and that we should never sort of blame science fiction for when people take Skynet or Terminator and run with it. There's so much more that's actually going on in those stories, but we just have those shorthand as it's disseminated amongst other people of, doom, gloom and disaster and robo-apocalypse. So in that case, I want to be careful that we're not sort of making any kind of moral judgment on science fiction, but it is very influential on the shapes of our imaginaries of the future. Yeah. I talk sometimes about Wellesian slippage. So if you know Orson Welles and his War of the Worlds broadcast, and how that was advertised in a limited way as a radio broadcast, but people tuned in partway through and got the sense that there was an actual invasion happening. And some of that's overblown in the story, that actually not so many people thought that. But there's that element of where science fiction is denuded of context and people take it up as truth. So I've done some work around, fake robots, where people have created robots specifically for science fiction purposes, but they're shared and disseminated, treated as though that they're real. We have the real Boston Dynamics robots, but then you have Corridor Crew, a CGI production company, who make their Boss Town robots, which they play with the tropes of the robo-apocalypse by using CGI to recreate the same sort of quadrupedal and bipedal robots, but they do run amok and they do attack humans and they run off with the pet dog. And some people react to those like these are genuine videos, because although the content and the context is there initially, but things can get shared and it becomes viral and it becomes mimetic in its own way. So there's this element at which science fiction informs our imaginations, but also we are very willing to adopt some of these shapes and run with them in a way that science fiction authors probably never expected. I mean, some of my previous work on new religious movements, I looked at Jediism, and there's no way George Lucas, the good Methodist boy that he was, I'm not sure he's still worshipping, but anyway, but he would never have intended to produce a specific religion in the real world, but people have taken those ideas and they run with them, and you can't really control for that.
Well, hearing about Jediism, it makes me wonder, is science fiction collapsing into real life? Does science fiction have a lot to answer for? I'm just thinking about like William Shatner being sent to space on Blue Origin, and it's so utterly surreal in so many ways that a figurehead from a science fictional captain of a starship now actually got to go to space. And the boundary now between what is fiction and what is real does feel like it's getting a little fuzzier.
I think it was ever thus, though. I mean, before we were telling ourselves stories about aliens and robots, we were telling our stories about fairies. Yeah. And, you don't have to go too far back in history to a point at which people were producing pictures of fairies. It's the late 1800s. Sherlock Holmes is creator. I almost said Sherlock Holmes got really involved. Sherlock Holmes' creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, got really involved with trying to prove the existence of fairies because of his spiritualist beliefs. So this author, who is upheld as the creator of the most rational detective there's ever been, was himself doing something that a lot of people now would class as irrational, trying to hunt down fairies and prove their existence. So we've got this sense we were always telling ourselves stories of the other. And I think AI makes a very good liminal other entity that we can tell stories about in the way that we talked about fairies before, we talked about dragons, or we talked about, aliens for a long time. And aliens don't seem as popular as they have been. So I think perhaps AI is the next alien entity that we're telling stories more and more about. But this sense of, there's this thing that is so malleable to our different concerns and interests, an object that we can tell different types of stories with. I think of like a child with a Rubik's Cube. We can shift and change it for various different purposes. And that produces wonderful science fiction. But just to go to your point about Shatner going to space, I mean, he wasn't actually the first person in Star Trek in space, because there was an astronaut who was then put in Star Trek in an episode. So someone can like write in comments answers who that was. It was a female astronaut. So this sense of like the fiction becoming reality, reality becoming fiction, these boundaries have been permeable for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
It's the only concern I have is when those boundaries are permeable and it leads to a distraction from actual potential societal harm caused by technology. That if AI is perceived as making godlike choices about our future, we'll ignore the points at which it makes actual choices about our future. So we had the whole disturbing A-level algorithm issue last summer, where so many students here in the UK, they didn't get their predicted grades because an algorithm was implemented that, looking at the data, the historical data from the school, made a decision about what grade they should get, not based on their singular merit, because the historical data was there. And the narrative that was presented when there was obvious pushback against this, because so many people were downgraded, was that this was a mutant algorithm that had gone off the rails, when really it just was fed the data it was given sort of values and weights and measures, and it produced outcomes. It didn't go mutant. So there's a sense of, the more we personify AI, and that is fed into by science fiction, the less we see the humans in the system. We see the AI more and more as the anthropomorphic entity, and we don't see the robomorphism of the humans being placed in the system. And that's a concern for me.
As we've been talking, it feels like we're constantly talking about the move towards more rationality. But hearing you describe some of these authors, it feels like what makes them so interesting is their ability to play with the irrational. Philip K. Dick famously used to converse with aliens. So do you think that despite technology's drive towards making human beings more rational entities, the thing that allows us to truly engage with the future is embrace the aspects of what it means to be human that also make us irrational?
So two parts to my response to that. So first, absolutely, as an anthropologist, I want to observe and be involved with the messiness of humanity. The cleaning up of humanity doesn't make any sense to me at all. We are messy creatures. But I also slightly, again, I'm not a big fan of dichotomies between the rational and the irrational. It's part of the same problem. Seeing the acceleration of intelligence as a move towards rationality, the Enlightenment narrative of we got smarter and better and we put away some of these things, and seeing others as irrational is the same. It's all part of the same game, really. So if we can stop using that sort of terminology and stop denigrating others as one or the other, because some people also would have a problem with the rational focus. So one of the characteristics of someone like Lieutenant Commander Data, and why we see him as distinct to his crew members, is the stereotype of the robotic rationality, the coldness that is implanted, and that's our view of the summation of what a rational being is. So those two sides of the argument have to come together and just recognize, as I say, that messy middle ground of sometimes we're rational, sometimes we're irrational. Do those terms actually make continuous sense?
So I do feel like I have to ask, if there was one science fiction story that you feel like everybody needs to engage with in their life, what would you put up there as the sort of pinnacle for how to best understand the future through sci-fi?
No, see, I can't do that, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, that is like picking amongst your children. But one thing I've done in the past, and I slightly regret it because maybe it's a bit mean, but I'm a bit of a troll sometimes. And people would ask me, and specifically ask me, do you really like Ex Machina? Isn't it the best singular AI film there has ever been? And I'd go, no, I think actually Short Circuit is better from the 1980s. And their faces,
Shani 5.
Their faces would drop, because if you've seen Ex Machina, I have problems with it, but it's a philosophical consideration of AI and what it means to be human, and to what extent do we trust AI, and will it turn against it? So all the kind of big questions that you would expect. And Short Circuit, if you've ever seen it, is a cheesy problematic representation of basically Frankenstein's story. Again, a military robot is hit by lightning and comes to life, and we get a representation of what it means for a robot to be alive. And it's not a good film, and it's not the answer anyone wants to hear, because they want the deep philosophical answer. But I think it's worth pointing out, because also it represents a different era in our thinking about AI and robots. It's 1980s. We've got a military application of robotics. Even then, you've got basically DARPA involved. And that was the stage we were at in our public narrative. And the representation of what it means to be alive is a representation of our 1980s understanding of what it means to be alive. So you enjoy television and you dance to pop music. And that's important as well. But it's not the answer anyone really wants to get from me. They want the deep and serious AI fiction that's going to enlighten them and open their minds. And I want them to enjoy silly 1980s films.
Well, on that wonderful note, Beth, I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you to Beth for sharing her thoughts on the relationship between theology and technology. You can find out more by visiting her website, bvlsingler.com. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.